Bedtime Reading. Black Beauty. Chapter 1. Beginnings. Just after my birth, I remember lying in the stable with my mother and looking out the door. I could see a lovely big field with trees around the edge and a good-sized pond to drink from. Beyond the fence that surrounded the field, I remember there being a stream from which a hill began its upward climb. And there, in the stable, while all of the other horses ate grass, I remember drinking my mother's milk. Usually, in the morning and afternoon, I would run with my mother or play with some of the young horses in the field. Sometimes this play became dangerous, and my mother would come and take me away from the other horses so I wouldn't get hurt. I liked the spring and summer seasons best because we would almost always sleep outside, while in the colder months we slept in Farmer Gray's stable. This was comfortable too, but I liked being out in the fresh air day and night. The farmer was a good horse owner. He took good care of us all, but he seemed to prefer my mother, whom he called Duchess, to the other horses. And because I was her baby, he started to like me as well. He called me Darky because of my black coat. Pretty soon I was eating grass like all of the other horses. Because I no longer needed her milk, and because she was his favorite horse, the farmer quickly put my mother back to work, pulling his carriage to and from the market, always coming back in the early evening. I remember one evening, just as she was returning from the market, I was playing with some of the other horses, and she called me over to her. I guess we must have been playing a little dangerously, because she said,
"Now, Blackie, I want you to always remember the good family you come from. Your father was a great racehorse, and your grandmother was one of the sweetest horses the earth has ever known. I never again want to see you playing so roughly with the others. I want you to grow up to be as wonderful as your ancestors. Just remember to always work hard, walk proudly, and never hurt others."
I promised her that I would do as she said. However, I had to admit that it was sometimes difficult to be kind to people when they weren't kind themselves. Dick, the worker boy, for instance, he was always throwing rocks at us when he should have been picking fruit. He would always upset the horses and get them running around trying to avoid the rocks. I'm not sure he realized how much it hurt us when they hit our back and legs. At least, I'd like to think he didn't realize it. Luckily, one day Farmer Gray caught Dick behaving this way. He walked right up to the boy, put some money in his hand, and told him to leave his farm and never come back again. And that was the last time we ever saw the boy. A little while after that, I remember playing in the fields and suddenly hearing dogs barking. It sounded as though they were coming toward our field. Someone yelled out, "Those hounds must have found a rabbit to chase." And they were right, because a rabbit soon entered our field through a small hole in the fence, and behind it came running a pack of dogs, and behind them 7 or 8 huntsmen, all on horseback. I strongly desired to join them in their hunt, but before I could even try, one of the huntsmen's horses fell to the ground after failing to jump over our fence. The young hunter riding this horse had been thrown several meters, and he lay there motionless. The horse tried and tried, but couldn't get back on its feet. It cried out in terrible pain. Soon the other riders gathered around the fallen huntsman. "Oh, good Lord! It's the squire's son Gordon!" one of them yelled. "He looks badly injured. Someone run and get a doctor now."
"That's not Rob Roy, is it?"
my mother cried, looking at the poor horse on the ground.
"Oh, no, it is, and I think he's broken something."
Then something happened I'd never expected. One of the huntsmen got off his horse, took out his gun, and shot Rob Roy right there in front of everyone. The horse immediately stopped crying out and lay still, never to move again. After 3 days or so, we noticed many carriages coming toward the church, being led by fine black horses. Between carriages there was a single black wagon, on top of which was a black box. The church bell rang slowly. I wasn't sure what was happening until my mother said,
"What a waste for 2 lives to be lost over a rabbit."
After this, she didn't say anything for several days, and she never again visited that part of the field where the accident happened. Chapter 2. My Training. As the months and years went on, I grew to become quite a good-looking horse, if I may say so myself. I was all black, the only exception being my right foot and a small mark on my forehead in the shape of a star, and several men had their money ready to give to Farmer Gray as soon as I became old enough to work. But the farmer promised never to sell any of his horses until they'd reached their 4th year. He didn't feel it was right to work them before that age. When, finally, the day came that I was 4 years old, Farmer Gray began to introduce me to various riding and pulling equipment that I would have to get used to wearing if I hoped to make a good workhorse. He decided to train me himself because I was one of his favorite horses, and he feared that some of the other trainers might frighten or hurt me accidentally. What I hated most about the equipment was wearing the bit and bridle. The bit is a metal piece that they put in horses' mouths, and attached to it are the reins, which the riders or carriage drivers pull on to guide the horse. I'd seen my mother wearing these before when she worked, but I never had any idea how much it hurt, because she never complained. Luckily, Farmer Gray was very gentle when he first introduced this equipment to me, and afterward he would always give me some food to eat and try to help me feel better. Soon, after I'd become more familiar with the bit and bridle, the farmer started to take me out into the field for walks in the early morning. Then he surprised me one day by putting a saddle on my back and climbing on. At first, I was worried that I wouldn't be able to carry him, because I felt so heavy, but I found myself jogging around the field, letting him guide me with the reins. For a long time, I'd thought the day would never come when I'd be carrying a man on my back. But now I was, and I hoped all of the other horses could see how well I was doing it. Now that I could be ridden, I would need horseshoes to protect my feet. So the next day Farmer Gray took me into the nearest village to see the blacksmith. When he first put them on me, they hurt quite a lot, but I quickly got used to them. Next came the harness, which is a large ring that fits around the neck and is used for pulling carriages and wagons. And with the harness also came blinders. Horses are sometimes easily frightened by the things they see around them, so blinders are placed around the horse's eyes, limiting their vision to only what is directly in front of them and nothing from either side. Now, even though a lot of these things were uncomfortable, I never complained or struggled against it. But one day I became angry when my master put a scrubber on me. This is a very tight rope placed under the tail. I was so angry that if it had been anyone else, I would have kicked him. But I loved Farmer Gray and would never have done anything to hurt him, so I just tried my best to accept this unfortunate piece of equipment. So this was everything I would need to be familiar with in order to become a working horse. Now it was time for me to practice using it. My master took me out with my mother to show me how to pull carriages and wagons. My mother was the best teacher. She showed me how to pull without becoming tired too quickly. For additional training, I was sent to another farmer's field. I remember one day running about and then suddenly seeing a huge, fast-moving machine with smoke rising out of the front. It was the first time I'd ever seen a train. I was frightened by the noise and by the way it looked. But looking around me, I noticed that none of the other animals in the field seemed frightened or surprised, so I soon lost my fear of trains as well. A couple of weeks later, after I'd returned to Farmer Gray's field, I remember running with my mother and her stopping suddenly and saying to me,
"Blackie, you must understand that not all men in this world are like Farmer Gray. Some men are horrible horse owners who don't take care of their animals and even beat them for no good reason. I hope that this never happens to you, but if it does, I want you to always do your best, like your father did. If you always do your best, life will eventually get better."
At first, I thought these words strange, because I never imagined having any other owner except Farmer Gray. But then I remembered seeing horses leaving the farm with strangers and never coming back, and I quickly realized that it was soon to be my turn. Chapter 3. I Am Sold. It wasn't long at all before I was sold to a wealthy man named Squire Gordon. He was the father of the young man who had died during that terrible rabbit hunt. He lived in a large house on a large piece of land, which he called Birtwick Park. It was hard to say goodbye to my mother and to Farmer Gray, but I understood that the time had come for me to go. I rubbed my nose against my mother's and was then led away by my new master. When I arrived at my new home, I was taken to the stables and placed in a very nice stall. Each stall held only one horse, and from what I could see, mine seemed to be one of the best. It was clean, and there was fresh hay for me to lie on, along with a bag of oats for me to enjoy. My stall was what they called a loose stall, where horses weren't tied to anything, but were left free to move around inside. After finishing my oats, I had a look around. The stall next to mine wasn't a loose stall. Inside was a fat but lovely gray-colored horse. I tried making friends with him by saying hello and asking his name. The horse couldn't turn around to see me very easily because he was tied, but he did his best and replied, "My name's Merrylegs. I'm quite popular with the young women, I'll have you know. They like me so much that I'm never asked to carry the men any more." Then, after a moment of looking me up and down, he asked me, "So they've given you the loose stall?" "It seems that they have," I answered. "You'd better be a gentle and friendly horse. I don't want you hurting me or—" Then a loud, angry voice interrupted Merrylegs, saying,
"This is terrible! What horrible times these are when a comfortable stall can be taken from an older horse and given to a younger one who needs it much less." I saw that it was a large brown female horse
with very angry eyes. "Now, there's no need for you to yell at me, lady," I answered. "I didn't choose this stall myself. I was put in here by our master. And I'm not as young as I look. I'm older than 4 years." The brown horse with the angry eyes didn't say another word, but simply turned away. Moments later, a worker came in and took her out for exercise. Seeing her gone, Merrylegs took the opportunity to speak. "Don't worry about Ginger. She's always like that. She's not very friendly, even to people, so no one wants to ride her anymore. She even bit the stable boy just recently." "She bites? Why would she do that?" "I have no idea, because we are treated very well here by the workers. They do their best to keep us healthy and happy, but Ginger never seems satisfied. It's because of her bad behavior that she lost her loose stall. So don't let her make you feel bad for having it now." The highest worker in Birtwick Park was a fellow named John Manley. He came in early the next morning and led me to the yard for a good grooming and cleaning. After he'd finished, the squire walked by and asked John to take me for a ride around the park, so that I might become familiar with it and get some exercise. While we rode, I kept my mother's advice in mind and did my best to impress him with my obedience and skill. I was happy when we reached the woods and he gave me a gentle touch with the whip to tell me to start running. He seemed quite pleased with my performance. When we returned to the stables, the squire was there waiting. "Well, John, what do you think?" "He's great, sir. He's very fast, and loud noises don't seem to frighten him. We passed some hunters shooting at rabbits, and he didn't even seem to notice. Okay, I think I'll take him out for a ride myself. Thanks, John." Again, I did my best to make the squire happy, and when we returned and found Mrs. Gordon waiting at the stables, the squire said to her with a smile, "This is one of the nicest horses I've seen. Let's think of a good name for him."
"I think he looks like an ebony or a blackbird,"
said Mrs. Gordon. "No, I think he deserves a better name. His coat is so black and beautiful,
"Why don't we call him Black Beauty, then?"
suggested Mrs. Gordon. And that's where my name came from. Later on, James, the stable boy who worked with John Manley, said, "I thought they'd call him Rob Roy, because they look so much alike." "They should look alike," John replied. "They are both sons of Farmer Gray's horse, Duchess." This was very sad news for me. I could now understand why my mother had become so upset after the hunting accident. It was her own son she'd seen killed there in the field. Chapter 4. I Get to Know Ginger. Soon after my arrival, they had me working, and one day I found myself working together with Ginger, pulling a carriage. To my surprise, we did a great job. I had expected her to be uncooperative, but she was just the opposite. We shared the work equally, which made things much less difficult. John was very pleased. He had very little to do except guide us with the reins. There was never any need to whip us into a faster run. On Sunday, I was led to the Birtwick apple garden with 4 other horses. My good friend Merrylegs, Ginger, who was becoming a little less angry with me, Justice, who was an older horse, and Sir Oliver, a retired hunting horse, who was one of our master's favorites. We all had a great time running around and playing in the grass there. It was so fun that Ginger, who was never very friendly, started to talk with me as if she wanted to be friends.
"So where were you born?"
she asked. I told her about Farmer Gray and how wonderfully we had been cared for on his farm. Hearing this, Ginger seemed to become a little sad.
"I didn't have such a nice life when I was younger. I had terrible owners and trainers."
She started to tell her story to me, and quickly I began to understand why she was always so unfriendly to everyone. She had been taken from her mother far too early and was forced to live with unfriendly horses. She told about some boys who used to come to the farm and throw stones at the horses, sometimes hurting them badly.
"Our master never once yelled at them or asked them to stop, so we soon started to think of humans, especially young boys, as our enemies."
"Tell me how you were trained, Ginger," I asked.
Oh, it was horrible. One day, a few men quickly approached me in the field and forced me to the ground, and then one of them held my head and another took hold of my nose while the third roughly placed a bit into my mouth.
Hearing this, I thought back to how gently Farmer Gray had introduced all of the new riding equipment to me. Then I asked Ginger what happened after that.
"I wasn't given any time to get used to the pain. I was immediately taken to a man named Samson, who put more equipment on me and then tied me to a long rope and made me run in circles for hours, whipping me every once in a while to prevent me from slowing down. And when I felt I couldn't run any longer, he put a saddle on my back and climbed on. I tried to throw him off several times, but he would just hit me every time."
Ginger's story made me sad. It hurt to hear such terrible things. I hoped that the story would soon end, but she seemed to have much more to tell.
"I did, finally, manage to throw him, and then I ran far away down the field and stood there feeling frightened and hurt from all of the hits Samson had given me. When, later that day, the owner came to lead me to my stable, and I saw Samson standing in the doorway, I started to try to run again, and the farmer immediately understood why. He looked at Samson and said, "What you did was wrong. You'd better learn quickly that bad people always make bad horses." And after that, I was sold to a wealthy Londoner whose only interest in horses had to do with his own desire to look wealthy and powerful.
"How could horses make him look wealthy and powerful?" I asked.
It was all in how he made the horses pull his carriage. We all had to wear the bearing rein, which is a terribly tight strap that pulls your head far back. It was terribly uncomfortable.
"It sounds like it must have hurt a lot," I said.
"I can't even describe it to you. It hurt so much. I got so tired of it that I finally did something about it. I kicked my way free from the carriage. The owner decided he couldn't trust me after that, so he sold me."
"Was your next owner a better man?"
I wish that I could say yes, but in fact, my next master and many masters after him all used the bearing rein.
"You've had many masters then."
It would be impossible for me to count them all. So far, this is the best home I've had. I know I still behave badly, but it's hard for me to change.
So Ginger and I quickly became friends, and now that she had a friend, she also became happier and stopped behaving so badly toward others. Even the workers started to notice a change in Ginger. I overheard James one morning saying, "You know, I think that brown horse is getting used to me." "You're good to these animals, James. They can't help but learn to be good to you, too." Chapter 5. A Stormy Night. It didn't take long for me to get used to Birtwick Park, being my new home. Ginger and I often pulled carriages together, and because our parents had been strong racehorses, we two were just right for riding as well. I liked the days when we all went out the most. Ginger always carried the squire, while I was responsible for his wife. Of course, Mary Legs and Sir Oliver always took the young women because they were older, and together we would all have a nice run for the morning or late afternoon. The squire's wife really knew how to ride horses well. She could guide me with just the slightest and most gentle of movements. One day, while we were all out for a ride, I saw that Sir Oliver's tail was quite short. By this time, we'd all become close friends, so I felt it safe to ask him about it. I assumed that he had been hurt somehow. "Hurt!" he shouted. "Hell yes, it hurt! I was young at the time, and they just tied me up, legs and all, and cut it off. And do you want to know the reason for it? It was all for appearance, but the pain eventually went away. What never went away were the damn flies. I've nothing with which to chase them away now. That's the saddest thing about it. You should be happy that short tails are no longer considered attractive."
"And I had to wear that horrible bearing rein for the same reason,"
Ginger put in.
"In the cities, it's still quite popular. Lucky for us, few people do that around here because of the squire and his wife. Whenever they see horses in bearing reins, they always tell the driver how unnecessary it is to make them wear it."
Hearing this, my opinion of the Gordons was now even higher than before, and from that moment I was always happy to pull their carriages no matter how far. A couple of days later, the squire had John harness me to one of his wagons to take him into town for business. It had been raining most of the day, so the roads were very muddy, and there was a strong wind blowing. I managed to pull the wagon pretty quickly until we arrived at a wooden bridge. The worker there came out to greet us with a few friendly words. "It looks like it's going to keep raining all day and night. You take care along the way." It was good advice, for the water often came as high as my knees in some of the lower areas. I had to slow down at these moments, but the master didn't seem to mind, and we soon made it to the town. The master must have had some very important business to take care of, because he didn't come back out until late into the afternoon. By this time, the wind was blowing even harder than before, and there were many more pools of water in the road now. I was doing well at keeping a good speed when suddenly there was a loud breaking sound, and then right in front of me a huge tree fell onto the middle of the road, blocking our way. John got off the wagon to see if he could move it, but it was too large. "Sir, we're going to have to go another longer way to the bridge. It's going to take us 6 miles out of our way." The squire told John to do what he thought was best. So, a while later, when we had reached the bridge, it was almost night. When I took a step onto the bridge, I stopped immediately, feeling that something wasn't right. "Go on, Beauty," said the squire, trying to gently urge me forward with the whip. Seeing that I wasn't going to move further, John jumped off the wagon. "What's wrong, Beauty?" I wanted so badly to speak to them so they could understand that something was wrong with the bridge. A moment later, the bridge worker saw us and started running our way, yelling, "Don't move! The bridge has a large hole in the center. You'll get killed if you try to cross." "Thank you so much, Beauty," shouted my master. Much later that evening, we arrived back at Birtwick Park, where we found the gardener standing in the yard waiting. Mrs. Gordon was so frightened, she ordered me to search for you." "Well, go on now and tell her we're all safe," said the master. "Let's go to the stables, Beauty." But we didn't get very far, for suddenly Mrs. Gordon came running out the front door toward us.
"I was so worried,"
she cried.
"Is everything okay?"
"Thanks to Beauty, everything's okay," replied the squire. As a reward for doing such a good job, John gave me a special dinner with a few extra oats, and he made an excellent bed for me that was so soft and comfortable, I fell asleep as soon as I lay down. Chapter 6. James's Promotion. Some time later, as John and I were returning home from having done some business in town for the squire, we came upon a boy who was trying to make his horse jump over a fence. The gate was pretty high, and the horse pretty young, so it was very scared and refused to move for the boy. This appeared to make the boy angry, for he started hitting the horse again and again. I was upset to see the horse being so cruelly treated. As we came closer, we watched the boy stand behind the horse and try pushing it forward, and when the horse still didn't move, he again started hitting it. This time, however, the horse yelled out and kicked with its back legs, sending the boy into some nearby bushes. "The boy deserved to be kicked," said John laughingly, as he watched the horse run away. "Hey, you there!" yelled the boy. "Come and help me out of these bushes." As we drove away from the boy, John said, "No, I think you're where you should be. Maybe next time you won't try to make a horse do something it's too young and afraid to do." Shortly after, as we were driving by a nearby farm, a man and woman came running out to us, asking if we'd seen their boy.
"He's gone for over an hour, and his little horse came running home without him."
"I think that horse is happier now that he lost the boy, who we saw beating him a few moments ago." "I'm sorry, sir. You saw our boy doing what?" the farmer asked. So John told him what he'd seen and added, "Sir, I'm sorry to be so angry with your boy, but no animal deserves to be treated so badly."
"Oh, I hope our boy is okay. I'm going to look for him now,"
cried the woman as she started hurrying down the road. But the man stopped her, yelling, "You just go back inside, woman. That boy has hurt that horse for the last time. I'll go get him, and when I do, he's going to get the same beating he'd given that horse. Thank you, sir, for telling us what you'd seen." We rode on, and as soon as we had arrived back at our stables, John told James about the boy. "That had to have been Bill Bushby," said James. "He probably deserved that kick from the horse. I knew him at school, and he was always thinking himself better than others just because he was a farmer's son. He used to be cruel to the younger students until I and some other boys stopped him. He would hurt anything he could get his hands on. I remember seeing him pulling the wings off a living fly one time." "James, could you run and get some oats for Beauty?" John asked. And just after James had left the stable, Squire Gordon entered carrying a letter. "John," he said, looking a little sad, "is James a fine worker, or have you sometimes found him doing things he shouldn't?" "He's an excellent worker, sir," said John. "Well, when you give him a job to do on his own, have you ever found that he stopped at a friend's house along the way, or took care of some business other than ours, and just left our horses alone for a period of time?" "Never, sir," said John. "I'd like to know who's told you such things, sir. I'd like to have a talk with that person and find out why he finds it so important to lie about James." Since the oat box was just outside of the stable, James had returned almost as quickly as he'd left, and heard the whole conversation between John and the squire. As he came back into the stable, Squire Gordon turned to him, saying, "James, my boy, we need to talk a bit. Come here, please." James put the bag of oats down and approached the squire, looking a little worried. "It seems that John has a very good opinion of you. I'm glad to know that, because I just received a letter from my sister's husband, Sir Clifford Williams. He's needing a new driver, so he asked me to recommend a young, honest, and hard-working man to replace his old one. I can't think of a better person than yourself. They'll pay you 18 shillings a week and provide you with all of your working clothes and a place to sleep. Oh, and you'll be given an assistant, too." James couldn't believe what he was hearing. This was great news. "Now, I must say that it's hard for me to give you away to another farm. I like your work, and I know John will miss you terribly." "That's right. But I'd never think of trying to change your mind about taking such a good opportunity." "How old are you, James?" asked the squire. "I'll be 19 in May, sir." "Well, that's a little younger than they'd asked for. John, what's your opinion?" "Well, sir, he is young, but he's quick and strong, and he has a natural understanding of how to treat horses, which I think makes up for his lack of driving experience. I think he's the best man for the job, sir." So it was agreed that, after 6 weeks of training, James would move to his new home. And for those 6 weeks, we were all busier than ever before. We were driven all over the countryside and all over town. After just 2 weeks, James was driving us completely on his own. Chapter 7. The Stable Fire. At about the 5th week of his training, the squire ordered James to drive him and his wife to the home of some friends who lived 45 miles away. So, one morning Ginger and I were taken out into the yard very early. We drove 32 miles that day, many of which were hilly. But James was good about guiding us around the bad places in the road, and he asked for the master's permission to let us rest twice during the journey. Finally, late that evening, we arrived at a hotel to rest for the night. As we approached the hotel stables, 2 men came out to untie us from the carriage harness. The man who helped me was very friendly. He led me gently inside the stable, where I noticed there were 3 other horses. James stood nearby, watching as the men cleaned us and prepared our beds. My worker was very good at his job. He did it all quickly and carefully. James looked me over carefully, greatly impressed by the man's work. "I thought I was quick," James said, "and John Manley even quicker, but you are faster than both of us." "Well, when you've been doing the same job for 40 years, you'd be fast too," replied the man. "You know, in all my years as a groom, I can't say that I've ever seen healthier and friendlier horses than these 2. "Whose horses are they?" "Squire Gordon of Birtwick Park," said James. "Oh, yes, I've heard that name. He's known for his excellent riding skills." "Yes, but he no longer rides as often as he used to. Ever since his son died riding this beauty's brother, he just hasn't had the desire." As James and the old man walked out of the stable, I again remembered that horrible accident and thought about how often my mother must still think about it. Later that evening, as we were about to lie down for the night, a stable worker brought in the horse of a traveler who'd just arrived. He groomed the horse and prepared his room for the night, and while he did all of this, a young man smoking a cigar came in to observe and chat. "Do me a favor and climb up to the 2nd floor and throw some hay into this horse's room," the worker asked the young man. "But be sure not to take that cigar with you, okay?" Some time later, James came back in to check on Ginger and I, and when he left, the door was locked behind him. I remember getting more and more tired, and I guess that I must have slept, but I don't know for how long. I awoke to the sounds of horses coughing and choking, and when I tried looking around to see what was wrong, I found that the stable was filled with smoke. Then I heard someone shout, "Fire!" And the man who'd groomed me earlier came running in. He managed to pull one horse out, but the fire prevented him from helping a second one. Then, just next to my ear, I heard James's voice saying very calmly, "Let's go, Beauty," as if there were nothing to be afraid of. He took his scarf and tied it over my eyes so that I couldn't see at all, and led me out of the stable. "I need someone to take this horse and tie it far away from the stable. I've another horse inside. I'm going back in." I was frightened for James. I wanted to tell him to be careful, and I actually tried when I saw him running back toward the stable. But of course my shouting must have been covered by those of the other equally frightened horses. All around me people were running and shouting here and there, trying to save as many of their horses and as much of their equipment as they could. But I was too worried about James and Ginger to pay much attention to anything else but the door of the stable. I could see the fire inside destroying everything quickly. I didn't believe it would be possible for both of my friends to survive. Then Squire Gordon came running. "Are you in there, James?" But the squire's shouts were not loud enough to be heard over the sound of falling metal and wood inside the stable. Just then a huge part of the roof fell to the ground, making a terribly loud noise. I thought all hope was gone, but suddenly I could see what looked like James's coat coming through the front door, and behind him followed Ginger. She told me later on that she could hear me crying out, and that had given her the courage to escape. Otherwise, she might have stayed in the stable from fear and died. Chapter 8. Mrs. Gordon Falls Ill. After the night of the fire, we had no further trouble, and managed to reach the home of our master's friend the very next day. We stayed for 3 relaxing days, and then returned to Birtwick Park, eager to share our story about the fire with the others. But James had other things on his mind. He was interested in finding out if John knew who was to replace him. "Little Joe Green," said John. "How can he replace me? He's too young." "That he may be, but he's also a hard worker and very well behaved. We're going to give him 6 weeks to get used to working here. If he's not doing well enough, we'll find someone else." And the very next day, Joe arrived to start his training with James. He was shown how to care for the animals and the equipment. James hadn't realized until now how many things he did every day. It seemed like so much. Merrylegs was the horse Joe got to test his skills on, because he was the most gentle of all the horses. At first, Merrylegs didn't like the way the boy did his work, but after a couple of weeks he found that Joe had greatly improved. The 2 weeks of training went by quickly, and it was soon time for James to leave. He seemed very sad to leave all of his friends, both human and animal. He had become very close to Merrylegs, and when he came over to say goodbye to him, he began to cry a little. After he'd gone, Merrylegs wouldn't eat for several days. John decided to take care of him personally instead of Joe, and by the following week the horse was back to his old self again. A few nights afterward, I was surprised out of my sleep by the sound of the stable bell ringing. Soon I saw John before me, saying, "Come, Beauty, we need your strength and speed more than ever tonight. The squire's wife is very ill." He had all of my equipment on in no time, and then led me to the front of the house where the squire met us. He was holding a letter in his right hand. "My wife's life is depending on you tonight, John. Here's a letter for the doctor. Don't waste any time, and make sure he comes tonight. I don't know how long she'll be able to wait, but you should make sure Beauty gets a little rest at the hotel, and just bring him back tomorrow." I ran like I'd never run before. Nothing could have slowed me down or stopped me, and we crossed a lot of difficult fields and roads. It was 8 full miles to the doctor's home, and every minute seemed like an hour. When we finally reached his home, it was 3 o'clock. John jumped from the carriage and hit the doctor's front door as hard as he could, but no one answered. Seeing that this wasn't working, he started to kick the door. If anyone else had seen this, they might have thought he was a robber or murderer, so desperately he seemed to want to get inside. Soon the second-story lights came on, and out the bedroom window came the doctor's gray face, shouting, "What in the hell are you doing? Trying to break down my door?" "Sir, I am John Manley. I work for Squire Gordon. Please, sir, his wife is terribly ill and is in great need of medical treatment. Come quickly." When the doctor came to the front door with his medical bag, he was still not completely dressed, and his hair looked wild. "I can't possibly take my horse. He had a very busy day today and wouldn't be able to take me that far very quickly. I must take yours." John didn't have much choice but to let the doctor take me, even though he knew I badly needed a rest. "Okay, take mine, but I must ask you not to use your whip on him. I promise you he'll get you to the squire's quickly." As soon as the doctor was sitting on my back, I could tell he hadn't any riding skills, and that I would be working even harder just to keep him from falling off. On the way back, he gave me a brief rest, which I appreciated greatly, although we would have made it back to Birtwick Park without it. When we arrived at the squire's home, we found him and Joe waiting in the front yard. Squire Gordon took the doctor directly to Mrs. Gordon, and Joe led me back to the stables. My coat was wet with sweat, and my legs were weak from all the running I had just done. "Don't worry, Beauty, you'll be fine. I know just what to do to make you feel better." And the boy meant what he said. However, because of his lack of experience, he made a few very serious mistakes that evening. He thought it a bad idea to give me a blanket because I was so hot, but without the blanket I soon became very cold, and he also gave me cold water, hoping to cool me down. I was so thirsty I just drank whatever he gave me without thinking. Joe stayed with me for a while and fed me some corn, but soon, thinking I was going to be fine, he turned out the lights and went to his sleeping quarters. And it was just after he left that I started to become cold. I wished he had given me that blanket after all, and I knew that John Manley would not be back for quite some time, so I did my best to lie down and rest. Many hours later, John finally returned. He immediately walked to my stall to see how I was. When he saw me shaking with cold, he became very angry and cried out, "Ah! How could that boy have done such a stupid thing?" At this time, I really did feel quite bad. I found it very hard to breathe. John covered me with a heavy blanket and sat next to me for the entire night until the squire came to the stable to see me. "Oh, Beauty, you did such a great thing today. You saved 2 people's lives, my wife's and my own, for I could never have gone on living without her." It's difficult for me to remember how many days I was ill. I know the doctor came to see me several times to check my blood and temperature, but eventually I started feeling better and better. and I remember the day that Joe's father came to visit me. "This really is a fine horse, John. Joe feels horrible about what he did. He realizes it was his fault, but he's sure it will never happen again. Would you mind saying a few kind words to him?" It seems that John did speak with Joe soon after his father's visit, for Joe was back working in the stable a couple of days later, and from that time on he was always very careful about everything he did, and he became a very reliable worker, in fact. But just to be safe, John always took care of Ginger and me himself. Then, one afternoon, while John was out on business with another horse, the squire needed a letter delivered to a friend a few miles down the road. He asked James to take it, with me as his horse. We finished the job quickly without any problem, so we rode back home slowly. On the way, we came upon a wagon that was too heavily loaded. It was so heavy that it couldn't move any further because the wheels had sunk deep into the wet ground. To our surprise, the driver was hitting his horse again and again. It seemed that he believed everything to be the horse's fault. James couldn't stand to see this, so he shouted, "Please, I'm free now. I can help you to lighten your load. Just stop hitting your horse." But the driver continued to hit the horse anyway. Joe became angry and jumped on my back, urging me toward the nearest house we could find. Luckily, the man who lived there was the owner of the horse being hit. Joe told him what we had seen, and the man thanked him for the news. "Will you tell the police what you just told me if I need you to?" "Of course I will," Joe answered. As soon as we returned to Birtwick Park, Joe told John everything. "You did the right thing, boy," said John. "Many people would have done nothing and would have tried to forget what they had seen, pretending it wasn't anything important." We horses were lucky to have Joe, because he soon became one of the greatest stable boys I'd ever had. But our luck would quickly disappear, for our lives were soon going to change. Chapter 9. Moving On. The illness Mrs. Gordon occasionally suffered from seemed to be returning more and more often now. Many times I had to bring the doctor to the house, and each time I did, the sadder Mr. Gordon seemed to become. We worried about her, knowing the situation was getting worse, but we were very surprised by the terrible news we soon received. The doctor decided that Mrs. Gordon could no longer live in this part of the country. She was ordered to move to a warmer area for a few years. This meant that the whole family would have to move and give up Birtwick Park. The day that the children and servants left was a very sad one. They, like everyone else, were saddest to leave old Merrylegs. He'd been with the family the longest. The squire agreed to sell Merrylegs to a good friend of his, as long as the friend promised never to resell him. And he also had to promise that when Merrylegs became too old to work, he would shoot him right away and bury him, instead of letting him live a long and painful life. I knew this because the squire told John about it while I was being groomed. I then told Merrylegs, but didn't mention anything about the second half of the agreement. Joe Green was also hired by the squire's friend. He was to care for Merrylegs and also serve the family in their home. As for John Manley, even though many people would have hired him immediately as their groom, he wanted to change his career and become a horse trainer. The squire, who thought very highly of John, arranged a meeting between his favorite worker and an important man in London who would be able to help him find the work he wanted most. Because Ginger and I worked so well together, we were sold together to a wealthy friend of the squire, who owned a large plot of land called Earlshall Park. And then the day arrived when Ginger and I were to take the Gordons to the train station. At this time everyone else had gone, except for Joe Green, John Manley, and a few house servants. It was sad to see the master come out the front door carrying his wife to the carriage. He set her down gently into the seat that the servants had earlier made more comfortable with pillows, and then he went around to the other side and climbed into the carriage himself. Leaning his head out of the window, he said, "Thank you all for everything. You've been such great help over the years. Goodbye." And then the carriage pulled away. On the way to the station, people came out of their homes as we passed. Some shouted, "Good luck to you," but most just wore sad faces without saying a word. After we'd arrived at the station and the Gordons were about to board the train, Mrs. Gordon said a few parting words to John. He remained silent, but I knew he was sad by the way he had been driving us. Joe Green was so upset he couldn't keep his tears back as he unloaded their luggage. We stayed at the station until the train began to pull away. Then we headed back to Birtwick Park for the last time. We stayed the night there, and early the next morning John came to take us to our new home, Earlshall Park. When we got there, the first thing John said to the carriage man was, "These are the best horses in the world. Please tell me that you will never use the bearing rein on either of them." "Unfortunately, we do use it here at Earlshall. I think it's wrong, and so does my master, but the lady of the house insists that it be used. There's nothing I can do about it." John looked at the ground, saying, "That is really sad." He walked around to Ginger and I to say goodbye. He seemed to pity us. We both rubbed our noses on his arm to tell him things would be okay, but he knew better than we did, and then he walked away, forever gone from our lives. Chapter 10. The Bearing Rein. I now had a new home and a new master, and it wasn't long before I had a new name, too, for the Earl decided to call me Baron. On our second day at Earlshall, Robert, our new groom, harnessed us both to a carriage and led us around to the front hall. Moments later, I could hear the sound of a silk dress approaching, and then through the front door suddenly came the lady of the house. She had a very serious face, and from the door to the carriage she said nothing. And it wasn't until she had organized her dress and become comfortable in her seat that she said,
"Drive."
And that was our introduction to the missus. We were, of course, wearing the bearing rein, because appearance was very important to the lady. And a good appearance in these days meant keeping your horses' heads very high. Luckily for me, I usually rode with my head high anyway, so it wasn't a very big change for me at first. However, it seemed that the missus was not quite satisfied with our appearance, for the next day she told the driver to tighten the bearing rein even more, because we looked too lazy. Now I could understand why Ginger hated the bearing rein so much. My head was pulled so far back that I found it nearly impossible to pull the carriage uphill. And yet the missus still felt we didn't look good enough. So the driver was again ordered to further tighten the rein. It felt horrible. We were all being forced into completely unnatural positions. It was no longer practical to pull a carriage. I quickly learned to hate it, but I always did my best, as my mother had told me to do. After a few days, the missus had not made any further complaints, so I started to feel that things wouldn't get any worse. But I soon learned that I was wrong. After Ginger and I had been there for 2 weeks, we became used to the schedule of picking up the missus at 3 o'clock every afternoon. One day she came down the front stairs, seeming very angry about something. This bad feeling of hers made her even more sensitive about our appearance. With horror, I heard her say to the driver,
Get those horses' heads up higher. I can't go to my friend's home with a team looking like that."
We couldn't believe that the bearing rein was going to be fitted even tighter. We were terrified. He fitted me first, and I could taste blood when the bit tore part of my mouth open. Then it was Ginger's turn, but she refused him, and the more he tried to tighten the rein, the angrier she became. Soon she began to kick so violently that she fell to the ground, pulling me down with her. The driver sat on Ginger's head to control her and called for one of the grooms to come and lead me back to the stables. For the first time in my life, I was terribly angry. Fortunately, after I was put back into my stable, no one came around to see me after that, because I would have kicked the first person I saw. After a while, Ginger appeared, being led to her stall by the driver, who was talking to himself, saying, "I knew these bearing reins would cause problems for the horses, and now the master is going to blame me for making the lady late for her friend's party." And indeed, the master was angry. When he arrived at the stables, he walked up to the driver and said to him, "You should know better than to listen to the missus. She knows nothing about horses." "Well, sir, to be honest, from now on, I'd rather you just gave me orders then." But this changed nothing, for the very next day we again wore the bearing rein. It seemed the missus was more powerful than the master. As for Ginger, her refusal to wear it gave the master no choice but to give her to his son as a hunting horse. So she never pulled the carriage for the missus again. Her replacement was a large male horse who did not seem to mind wearing the bearing rein. I couldn't understand, so one day I asked him how he could bear it. I didn't like his answer. "Although I know it's ruining my health and will cause me to live a shorter life, I must wear it. I have no choice. None of us has a choice." And it was this way for the next 4 months. Soon the tightness of the rein started to cause water to flow from my mouth uncontrollably. Sadly, many people thought this was attractive. They didn't realize that it was just as unnatural for a horse to do this than it was for a man. But this wasn't the only problem. My head was pulled back so far that it hurt my neck and chest. Even when I was resting in the stable, my whole body ached. Soon I felt nothing but pain and sadness. I missed my old home and my old friends. Here at Earlshall Park, I had no one. Then spring arrived, and happily the master and his wife left the park to visit some friends in the city for a while. During this time, I was ridden by one of their daughters. Her name was Lady Anne, and she was a good rider. Almost every day we would go out. Usually we were accompanied by a man named Blantyre, who owned a large female horse called Lizzie. She was a strong and healthy horse, and Blantyre rode her proudly. It was popular in those days for women to ride side saddle. I enjoyed carrying the ladies because they were always very gentle. One day, however, I was surprised to hear Lady Anne ask Blantyre to put her saddle on Lizzie. I didn't mind carrying Blantyre. I knew I was strong enough to satisfy him, but I worried about Lady Anne riding such a powerful horse. "I don't think it's a good idea. She's not an easy horse to control," Blantyre said.
"You cannot change my mind. You're always talking about how great Lizzie is. I want to find out for myself," replied the lady. He did as he was told, and together we rode to the village post office, where Blantyre had to send an important letter. "Just wait here, dear. I'll only be a few minutes," Blantyre said as he loosely tied me to a pole outside the office. Lady Anne laughed and said, "There's no need to worry. I'll be waiting here when you come back out."
Only moments after Blantyre had gone inside, a boy being pulled by a small team of horses came speeding past us. He seemed to be in a great hurry, for he was hitting them again and again, trying to get them to run faster. The team nearly ran into Lizzie, who was closer to the road than I was. This frightened her terribly. I tried to calm her, but it was no good, for seconds later she was running full speed down the road. I made as much noise as I could to get Blantyre's attention. Soon he came running out, and seeing Lady Anne far down the road, he quickly climbed onto my back. I didn't even wait for him to urge me on. I turned around and started running as fast as I could. After a few minutes, we arrived at a point where the road divided. We couldn't see which way Lizzie and Lady Anne had gone. Luckily, a boy standing nearby had seen them go right and enter a park. So now we were no longer running along roads, but across fields, and soon we could again see Lady Anne in the distance. As we came closer and closer to them, we could see that they were heading toward a stream. Then our greatest fears suddenly came true. When Lizzie jumped over the stream, her front legs didn't reach the top of the hill on the other side, causing her to fall hard to the ground. Lady Anne flew over Lizzie's head and onto the field. Blantyre cried to me, "Let's go, Baron! You can make that jump!" I gathered all the strength I could, and with one huge push of my back legs, I jumped over the stream and cleared the hill as well. We then ran to where Lady Anne had fallen, and Blantyre jumped to the ground. He placed his hand under the lady's head and urged her to speak. "Please, Anne, say something." Her face was terribly white, as if there was no more blood running through her body. But soon a gentle cry could be heard coming from her mouth. A man who had been cutting the field grass nearby came running over, and Blantyre ordered him to take me to fetch the closest doctor he could find. "And bring a carriage back with you, quickly!" The man had no idea how to ride a horse, but I did my best to keep him from falling off while running as quickly as possible. And within a couple of hours, Lady Anne was lying in her bed back at Earlshall Park. 2 days later, Blantyre came to visit me with Robert the groom. "That's him," he said, touching my nose gently. "That's the horse that saved Anne. Good old Baron. Promise me that from now on you will only let her ride him, and no other horse." Chapter 11. I Move On Again. Sadly, this wasn't to be the only unpleasant experience I would have while the master and mistress were away. A man named Reuben Smith had been hired to care for us during this period. He was usually a very good and gentle worker. He was friendly and well liked by everyone. But he had one very bad habit: drinking. The driver was very good friends with Reuben, so he did everything he could to try to keep this bad habit of his a secret from the master. But one night, when Reuben was asked to drive the master's friends home from a party, he was so drunk that he couldn't even see the road in front of him. It became so dangerous that one of the party guests had to throw Reuben out of the seat and take control of the horses. The master fired him as soon as he had heard the news. So Reuben and his wife and 2 children all were forced to leave their pleasant little home in Earlshall Park. I learned about this from the male horse I always pulled the carriage with, for Reuben had been fired before Ginger and I arrived. But now, after promising not to drink on the job, he had been hired back by the master. A few days after Lady Anne had fallen from Lizzie, Reuben rode me into town to take care of some business. He had me wait at White Lion's stable, where many workers left their horses for part of the day. He told the stable boy that he would return around 4 o'clock and to feed me before then. However, 4 o'clock came and went. When he arrived an hour later, I was relieved and ready to head back home, but he told the boy that he was meeting some friends and that he'd be back no later than 6 o'clock. But before he could leave the stable, the boy caught his arm, saying, "Sir, I notice that one of your horse's shoes seems to be falling off. I can repair that for you, no problem." "Ah, never mind that," replied Reuben. "I'll fix it myself later." It was not until 9 o'clock that he returned to get me. I could tell right away that he was very drunk. "Be careful, sir," said the stable boy, noticing the difficulty Reuben was having climbing into the saddle. "Shut up, boy! I know what I'm doing," he shouted just before digging the back of his boots into my side to get me going. As soon as we reached the edge of town, he had me running hard. The streets were made of stone, which made my shoe soon come completely off. Reuben was too drunk to know what happened, so he kept hitting me, trying to make me run faster and faster. Now my foot had no protection, and the stones were cutting it up badly, making the pain more and more terrible every time I set my foot on the ground. But Reuben kept hitting me, demanding greater speed. Finally, the pain became so great that I suddenly fell to my knees, and Reuben flew straight ahead, landing with a loud thud in the middle of the road, several meters away from me. I somehow got back onto my feet and made my way to the side of the road to avoid being hit by traffic that might come around the corner. Reuben tried pushing himself to his feet as well, but he must have been in terrible pain, for he suddenly cried out and fell back to the ground, where he lay very still. 3 hours later, I heard a voice shout, "Hey there! I see Baron!" It was the groom from Earlshall. He came running over to me and took my foot in his hand and shook his head, saying, "His foot looks very bad, and so do his knees." Then, from the road, I heard someone shout, "Hey, Robert! Reuben's dead." I'm sure he'd been drinking, because this horse was in no condition to be ridden tonight, answered Robert. After putting Reuben onto a wagon and wrapping my foot in cloth, I was carefully led 3 miles down the road, back to Earlshall Park. Robert took care of me the best he could for the rest of the night, feeding me corn, wrapping my knees, and preparing my foot for the doctor who would be coming the next morning. When the doctor arrived, he looked at me closely. "Physically, the horse will be just as strong and healthy as before, but his appearance will now be less attractive because of his damaged knees," he reported to Robert. And he was right. For a couple of weeks later, I was running in the fields, not yet fully recovered, but getting better and better by the day. One day, as I was exercising, I met Ginger. I had not seen her since she kicked herself free from the bearing rein. I was very happy to have run into her, but once we began to talk, my happiness quickly disappeared. She told me that the master's son had ridden her too hard, too often, and now she was no longer able to do the job.
"And so,"
she said, looking at my knees,
"here are 2 young horses who, instead of being healthy and strong as they should be, are now weak and damaged by the carelessness of a young fool and an old drunk."
When the master finally returned from London and discovered what had happened to us, he said to his driver angrily, "All that money spent for nothing. And what's worse is that I promised my friend Squire Gordon that he could trust me to take good care of his favourite horses." He decided to keep Ginger for another year to see if her health could be restored, but Because of the appearance of my knees, I was to be sold. The driver then spoke up. "I've got a friend in Bath who's needing horses. He's known to care for them very well." "Fine. Send him a letter, inviting him to see Baron. I don't care who owns him, as long as they will take good care of him." And a week later I was sold. As I was being led away by Robert, I hadn't the opportunity to say goodbye to Ginger, but I heard her voice yelling out to me in the distance as I walked down the road away from Earlshall Park. She did not stop yelling until I was out of sight. Chapter 12. A Job Horse and Its Drivers. My new master was the owner of a horse and carriage rental business. He lived far from Earlshall Park, so it was necessary for me to travel by train. That took me some time getting used to, but after a while I stopped noticing the strange noise and movement of the train. And when I finally arrived in Bath, I was taken to my new home and led to a nice stall where I was pretty well cared for. I was one of many horses owned by the businessman. He sometimes drove us, but most often we were driven by strangers who would rent us for the day. Before now, I had always had excellent drivers, but now I had to get used to less experienced ones, of which there were 4 types. The first type were the clingers. These were people who would never relax the reins, keeping the horses close to the carriage at all times. Then there were the loose drivers, who let the horses do most of the decision-making and work, never guiding us until the very last moment, when they'd realized we were heading in a direction they did not want to go in. Often this would nearly cause the horses to fall, but the drivers were so inexperienced that they couldn't tell the difference. And there were the impatient drivers, who wanted us to drive quickly from the moment we left the stable to the moment we returned. They would get angry if we slowed down, and they were often too aggressive with the reins, pulling them too hard, too suddenly. But occasionally we would get a good driver. One of my favorites was a man named Mr. Barry. He started to prefer me to all of the other horses, and one day, after his doctor suggested that he get more exercise, he persuaded my master to sell me to him. Because Mr. Barry was a single man who lived in a boarding house in London, he had to rent a stall and hire a man named Filcher to care for me. I heard him say to Filcher, the first day he came to work, "Be sure to give my horse only the best food and bedding." This made me very happy, for I believed that I could now become as happy as I had been before. And in the beginning, it seemed that this really were going to be true, because my stable was kept clean and well lighted. But then I began to be given less and less food until I started to seriously weaken. When one day Mr. Barry rode me out to one of his friends' farms, I was feeling pretty tired. The farmer noticed this and said to my new master, "What seems to be troubling your horse? I remember him looking much healthier than this when you first bought him." "You know, I noticed that myself, but my groom told me not to worry because it's normal for horses to weaken in autumn." "That's not true at all. First of all, it's still summer, my friend, and second of all, there's no reason for a horse to weaken unless he's not being properly taken care of," shouted the farmer. "You'd better watch that groom of yours more closely. I think he might be stealing some of your horse's food." At that moment, I wished that I could speak, because I had seen Filcher come into the stable with his son and leave with a large bag of my oats. Happily, my master trusted his farmer friend's advice, and a couple of days later, when Filcher's boy was leaving the stable with my oats, 2 policemen stopped him at the door. "Now, boy, we know your family takes care of rabbits," they said, holding the boy's arm. "You take us to your home now, and show us where you're putting the food. So the boy did as he was ordered, and at the rabbit cages they found many empty bags of oats, my bags of oats. They arrested Filcher and his boy immediately, even though Filcher denied having stolen them. The boy was let go because of his age, but his father stayed in jail for 2 full months. The next person hired to be my groom was a man named Alfred Smirk. He was a handsome man who knew too well that he was handsome. He would spend hours working on his hair and mustache, trying to make them look just as he wanted them to. Whenever my master gave him an order, Smirk would always stand up straight and yell out, "Yes, sir, of course, sir," as though my master were the leader of all England. To most people he seemed a good worker, but I knew better. I knew how false he was the first time I heard him shout out, "Yes, sir, of course, sir," and my feeling could never have been more correct, because he was probably the laziest groom I had ever met in my life. My body began to smell more and more because he never cleaned me, and because he never cleaned my stall well, I started eating less, and my eyes began to hurt from the smell. When Mr. Barry, noticing the strong smell coming from my stall, asked Smirk if he should clean up my area and use water to wash away the waste, my groom replied, "Yes, sir, of course, sir. However, you know it's a bit dangerous to use water these days. It could make the horse ill, sir." "Well, something has to be done about that smell. Might it be the drain?" asked my master. "Well, sir, now that you say this, I think the drain does sometimes smell." "Okay, then. Have a man come here to fix it immediately," ordered Mr. Barry. Of course, when the worker came to fix the drain, he found nothing wrong. However, he did not tell my master this, because he would not have been paid anything. So he was paid 5 shillings for doing nothing. Soon it became hard for me to walk properly. The dirty, wet straw I was standing in all day had started to hurt my feet. "Smirk, have you noticed my horse's walking lately?" asked my master. "Yes, sir. Of course, sir. I saw that he was having difficulty during this morning's exercise," said Smirk. The truth was that Smirk almost never took me out for exercise. Instead, he fed me oats all day, so now I had become much heavier than I had ever been before, and from staying in my stall all day, I soon became nervous and started to run an occasional fever. To help me to become calm and lose my illness, Smirk could have just given me some bran mash or green meal, but he knew nothing about caring for horses, so he gave me many different medicines, which only succeeded in making me feel worse. Things became so bad for me that one day, when I was out carrying the master, I nearly fell to the ground. It was my feet. The pain had become so great that I could no longer stand it. My master saw this and took me to the blacksmith immediately. The blacksmith could see right away that I had a serious foot illness. He asked my master how it was possible that my groom had not noticed and taken care of this before now. "How could my horse get such an illness?" asked Mr. Barry. "Usually this illness comes from horses standing in a dirty stall all day. Have your groom bring this horse to me tomorrow, and I'll give him the proper medicine and show him how to care for your horse's feet." Mr. Barry did not bother to ask the groom to take me the next day. He took me himself. There, my feet were cleaned with a very strong medicine that smelled pretty bad. After this, the blacksmith reminded my master to make sure my stall was cleaned very carefully, and that all of my straw was replaced every day. I was also to be fed nothing but bran mash and some green meal until I was feeling better. Mr. Barry was very angry with Smirk. As soon as we returned home, he fired him. My master then cared for me himself. By this time, he had already decided that keeping horses was much too difficult, because of all the dishonest workers in the world. So, as soon as I was healthy again, he sold me. Chapter 13. Working for a Cabman. Horse fairs are terribly frightening places for horses. People cannot understand this, because to them it is an exciting and fun place to visit, especially for children. But the horses there are to be sold, and their biggest fear is that they will be sold to a terrible man who will care for them poorly or work them to a quick death. I had many visitors who looked at me very carefully, but every time they saw my knees, they would immediately lose interest and walk away. One time, a man started looking at me and handling me very roughly. I knew he would be a cruel owner, and I began to fear being sold to him. He offered £23 to Mr. Barry's agent, but this offer was rejected for being too low. And then I felt relieved. Then, a little later, a kind-looking gentleman began to look at me. He looked at my knees and then looked in my eyes. He seemed to feel pity for me. "Okay, boy, don't worry," he said, touching my nose. Then, turning to the agent, he shouted, "I'll give you £24 and 10 shillings, and that's a very fair price, so no arguing." "All right, he's yours," the agent replied. After taking me to a hotel where I was fed and cleaned, the master put a saddle on my back and said with a smile, "Okay, boy, we're going to London." When we arrived in the city, I was surprised to see all of the streets there. I was used to seeing only 1 or 2 roads at a time, but here there were thousands of them. It was evening, and all of the streetlights were lit. We walked for about a half an hour until we stopped in front of a poor-looking house. My new master shouted, "Hello there, I'm home!" And then the front door opened, and a woman and 2 children came running out to greet him. He asked the boy to open the stable doors and to light the stall. Everyone seemed excited. When I was taken to my stall, the whole family stood around me.
"Is he a nice horse?"
the young girl asked her father. "Very nice, Dolly. The nicest horse I could find. Go ahead and touch his nose."
"I'll feed him while you clean his coat,"
said the woman, picking up a bag of oats. "I think that's just what he needs, Polly," replied my master. And now my life seemed to be good again. I lay down in my clean stall and dreamed about how wonderful it will be to stay with this family. This was probably the happiest family I had ever seen. My master's name was Jerry. He was a cab driver. His wife Polly was a plump woman with dark hair and dark eyes. She took very good care of the house and children. Their son Harry was a very well-behaved boy, and the same could be said of his sister Dolly. The whole family took care of me and made me feel very loved. Jerry did not work for a cab company. He worked for himself and owned his own cab. He had another horse named Captain who pulled the cab in the mornings. I always worked in the afternoons. Jerry always treated me very well. He never once made me wear the bearing rein. And I have to say, I often saw horses in the city wearing those terrible things. And whenever I saw this, I appreciated my master's kindness more and more. I have to say that it was very difficult for me to drive at first, because of all the noise and people in London. I was used to the quiet countryside. But Jerry did his best to keep me calm that first week, and soon I lost all of my fears. Jerry did not like to overwork his horses. Many drivers drove 7 days a week, but we only drove 6 days because he believed it was God's day and no one should work. And he never drove us quickly, even if the passenger demanded it. I can remember one time when 2 young men approached our cab shouting, "Victoria Station! And if you can get us there before 1 o'clock, we'll pay you extra." My master simply said to them, "I can take you there, but I won't make my horse run." Hearing this, another cab driver said to the young men, "He never runs his horses. Just take my cab. I'll get you there before 1 o'clock." And so they jumped into his cab, and he began to whip his horse into a terrible run. Jerry just watched them go and said to me, "That poor horse. And it's just the middle of the day, too." Chapter 14. Conversations with an Army Horse. During my time with this family, I became pretty close to Captain. He had many interesting stories to tell me about his past. One day he began to tell me about his days as an army horse. He spoke proudly about the strict training he received and how wonderful it had been to walk in line with the other excellent horses, carrying brave soldiers on their backs. But soon we were sent to a place where there was much fighting, with the British and French on one side and the Russians on the other. "And did you get involved in the fighting?" I asked. "Of course," he said. "We were taken to the battle areas, and once we heard the officer shout an order, we followed it immediately, no matter what the situation. And let me tell you, there were guns and knives coming at us from all directions, most of the time. I carried my master into battle many times without being hurt. I saw horses killed with guns and swords, and I saw brave men die. But my master's courage made me believe that I could never be killed." Captain stopped here for a moment before continuing. He seemed troubled suddenly. "I never felt frightened until one horrible day." "What happened?" I asked. "Well, it must have been autumn at the time. It was morning, and we were up very early. Everyone seemed excited about today's battle, as if it were going to be a decisive day somehow. As soon as the enemy started firing their guns, we were ordered into line. My master, being one of the bravest soldiers, got us up to the front of the battle line and said to me, 'Captain, today will be a hard battle, but we will not give up the fight.' Then the officer shouted for us to charge the enemy. We all ran forward as fast as we could, caring very little about the danger before us. To my right and left, I saw many of my companions fall. My master kept me running forward, and as we did, the sounds of the guns and enemy shouting became louder and louder. To my right and left, I now saw more British horses and soldiers running with me. No one was going to give up, just as my master had said. Seeing this, I became even braver and started running so fast I felt I might soon be flying. But then, directly in front of me, I saw one of the Russians' biggest guns fire. There was nothing but a cloud of red smoke, and just as my master was shouting encouragement to his fellow soldiers, I heard something fly past my head, and my master suddenly became very quiet and stopped moving. The reins loosened, and then he fell to the ground. I didn't want to leave him there to be run over by all the other horses, but there was nothing I could do to help him. I hadn't much time to think about it, because moments later another British soldier jumped onto my back and urged me to run forward. I fought for the rest of the day until the enemy defeated us. There was blood everywhere and cries of pain all around me. Most of my friends had been killed. "What about those who were still alive, like yourself? What happened then?" I asked. "We were taken back to England, along with the dead. Those horses who couldn't walk, due to their wounds, were shot. I am guessing that only a fourth of all the horses that had begun that battle went home alive. I continued to fight in the army for many years after that, but I never admired or loved any of my masters the way that I loved and admired the one who died that day. I was injured a few times, but never too seriously, and when the fighting finally stopped, I returned to England, as healthy as I had been before I joined the army. Did you ever find out why the countries were at war, or why you were fighting? I asked. No, it's something humans just do. But the enemy must have been pretty terrible, for so many people have traveled so far to fight. Chapter 15. Life in the City. There is a day that I remember very clearly from that period. It was approaching noon, and Jerry and I were waiting at the cab station, when a man carrying what seemed to be a heavy bag stepped on a banana peel and fell to the ground very hard. My master jumped down from the cab and helped the man to his feet and into a store. After several minutes passed, the man came out of the store and approached us to ask if we could get him to the train station quickly, for he feared his fall might prevent him from catching the 12 o'clock train. I can only promise you that my horse and I will do our best, replied my master. Do what you can, for I really have to catch that train. I'll even pay you extra. So the man carefully climbed into our cab with Jerry's help, and we were soon off to the train station. But getting there quickly was going to be very difficult, for the city was always very busy at this time of day. Because Jerry and I knew the city streets so well, we were able to avoid a lot of the bad traffic, but when we arrived at Cheapside, the traffic was completely stopped, and there was little we could do. Seeing this, the passenger said that it might be best for him to walk to the station from there, but my master told him that it was still too far to walk with all of the bags that he had. He would never make it in time. And just after he had said this, the traffic started going again, and we had a nice run straight across London Bridge, which allowed us to arrive in front of the station 8 minutes early. This made the man extremely happy. I can't tell you how much you have helped me. Here, take this extra money. That's okay, sir. You needn't give me that. Just be sure to catch that train, replied Jerry. And having said that, he called over the luggage boy and arranged for him to take the man and his luggage to the proper train. Then we quickly pulled away from the station so that the man could not try giving us the extra money again. Many drivers had seen this, and when we returned to the cab station, they started to make jokes about it. I can't believe this guy, one of them said. First he refuses to take those 2 young guys in his cab when they offered to pay him well for it, and now he's just refused money again. You just can't seem to understand, gentlemen. First of all, the man really needed to catch that train. I wanted to help him and nothing more. Second of all, my horse and I sometimes like to run for fun, and lucky for that man, today was one of those times. And lastly, it's none of your business what we do. On another occasion, a well-dressed man came to the cab station, and, after walking past all the other cabs, approached ours. Yes, sir, what can I do for you? Asked my master. I'd like to offer you a well-paying job. Mrs. Briggs has begun to attend church services every Sunday, and she would like you to drive her. Sundays, huh? I'm afraid I don't work on Sundays, sir, and I think I'd need a special license to work 7 days a week. I could very easily get that license for you, sir. Mrs. Briggs thinks you're the best driver in the city. She wants no one else. And nothing could make me happier than to drive such a nice lady as Mrs. Briggs. But I wasn't used to work 7 days per week, and it was too hard on my horses and me. And I like to spend Sundays with my family. We go to church, too. The gentleman argued with my master for a few more minutes, but Jerry continued to politely refuse. Finally, the gentleman gave up, saying, Fine, Mr. Barker. We'll find someone else." And he walked off looking disappointed. Later that evening, my master told his wife about the job offer. He said that he felt bad having refused such a nice woman, and he also felt a little guilty because she would have paid him well, and that would have helped his family. Polly took hold of Jerry's hand and said,
"Honey, I don't care how much she might have paid you. The most important thing to us is spending our Sundays with you. You did the right thing today. You have nothing to feel badly about."
Soon, almost all of the other cabmen knew about Jerry's decision. Most of them thought he was crazy, but there were a few who stood by his side. One day the drivers got together and criticized Jerry to his face. After they had finished, he just looked at them all without much seriousness and said, "There shouldn't be any need for cabs on Sundays. People can find their way without a cab 1 day out of 6. People were all given legs for walking, and if church is important enough, they will find a way to get there. And if the weather is bad, man has made coats to protect himself from the elements. Let them make use of this as well. If a thing is right, it can be done, and if it is wrong, it can be done without." And none of the other cabmen had any answer to that. A few weeks later, after a full day's work, we came home to find Polly waiting excitedly to tell Jerry something.
"Guess what happened today?"
she said to my master with wide-open eyes.
"Mrs. Briggs' servant came by to tell us that the lady wants you to pick her up tomorrow morning. She has accepted the fact that you don't work on Sundays, and while she's disappointed, she knows that you keep the best cab in the city. So it looks like you haven't lost your biggest customer after all."
And hearing that, my master smiled and turned to me, saying, "Well, all right, my friend. It looks like we are to drive the wealthy again." And we were to drive Mrs. Briggs as often as we ever had, but she never asked for us to work on Sundays. However, there was one exception. After a long day of work on Saturday, Jerry was grooming me in the yard, enjoying the restful morning of Sunday. But then Polly suddenly came running out of the house, looking worried. "What's wrong?" asked Jerry.
"It's Dinah Brown. She just found out that her mother might be dying. She wants to see her before she does, but they live almost 10 miles apart. Taking the train is no good because it stops several miles from her mother's home and she'd have to walk from there."
Jerry said nothing.
"Can you take her, Jerry? She promises to pay you as soon as she saves up the money."
"Now, you know I don't care about the money, Polly. The horses and I are very tired, and we've another long work week ahead of us."
"You know we should help others as we would like them to help us,"
said Polly.
"And even though I'll miss you today, I know that if it were my mother who was dying, I would beg you to take me to her in the cab."
"Yeah, I guess you're right," Jerry said, laughing. "Go ahead and tell Dinah I'll pick her up at 10. And if you don't mind, stop at Butcher Bryden's and see if he will lend us his carriage for the day." Jerry wanted Mr. Braden's carriage because it was nicer than his cab, in that it was not as heavy and the wheels were much larger. All this made it much easier to pull. And today we had a long way to go. We were lucky, actually, because today was a perfect day for being outside. The weather was wonderful, and driving through the countryside reminded me of the good old days. Besides, I needed a break from the city. We arrived at Dinah's mother's home without any trouble. I was put in a lovely little meadow with tall grass where I played all morning. I hadn't enjoyed myself that much in quite a long time. And later, while I had a rest in the shade, I realized that this had been the first time I'd run in a field since Ginger and I last saw each other. Later that day, as we arrived back at home, The ladies of the house, Holly and Dolly, were outside in the front yard. Jerry jumped from the driver's seat, and from behind his back he brought out some wild flowers he had picked along the way and gave them to his little daughter. He then looked at his wife and said, "I have to admit, Polly, this was an excellent Sunday. All the way there and back I got to listen to the birds sing the most beautiful songs, and our horse seemed to have grown 4 years younger. I've never seen him play so much." In the winter, as Jerry and I waited at the cab station for customers, Dolly would often come running down to see if we were there. If we were, she would then run back home and return to us with some hot food and drink. On one such day, as Jerry was eating his soup with his daughter sitting by his side, a wealthy customer asked for our services. Seeing this, Jerry quickly handed his soup to Dolly, but before he could do anything else, the man shouted to him, "Wait! You can finish eating first. I need to be somewhere pretty soon, but I have time to wait for you to eat your soup and see your daughter off home." Jerry raised his hat to the man in thanks and said to his daughter, "Now, you see that man there? That's what a real gentleman looks like." So after finishing his meal and taking Dolly home, Jerry asked the man where he wished to go. "To my home at Clapham Rise, please." When we arrived, the man's dogs came running out to greet him at the gate, and before going in, he turned to me and touched me gently on the nose, which was not an ordinary thing for men to do. Usually, it was the women who liked to do that. To men, a cab horse was only a cab horse, a thing. From that time on, we drove the gentleman quite often, and on one occasion he and another gentleman entered our cab. The stranger, a friend of his, told us to take them to Rye Street. At Rye Street, we waited outside while the stranger went inside a store. As we waited, I noticed 2 horses harnessed to a cart in front of a wine shop. Their owner must have been inside, and he must have been gone for quite some time, because the horses started to walk away as though they had given up on waiting for him. About a minute later, their owner came running out to catch them, and when he did, he started to whip them angrily. The gentleman in our cab saw all of this happen, and he immediately jumped out of our carriage and ran over to the man, yelling, "Stop that this moment! I'll have you arrested if you don't." It seemed that the horse owner had been busy drinking wine inside the store, for his speech was unclear and his movements were very clumsy. He started to yell horrible words at the gentleman and then drove away. As he did, the gentleman took a piece of paper from his pocket and started writing something down. "What are you writing there, my address?" shouted the drunken man. But the gentleman did not answer. He simply smiled and then walked away. By this time, his friend had come back out of the store and climbed into our cab. He shook his head when he saw his gentleman friend and said, "Now, why would you bother yourself about some stranger's horses, right? I'd think that you'd have better things with which to occupy your time." "Do you know why the world is such a bad place?" said Mr. Wright after a few moments, and when his friend didn't answer, he continued, "It's because of ideas like yours. It's because too many people care only about themselves and never bother to help others when they need it. If your horses were being treated like that, wouldn't you want someone to tell you about it?" When Jerry and I heard this, our respect for the gentleman became even greater than before. One day, when we were at the cab station waiting for a fare, a cab in bad condition, pulled by a tired old brown female horse, came up beside ours. I could easily see the horse's bones showing through her dull, poorly cared-for coat. Her knees were in poor condition, and her front legs looked very weak. As I was eating some hay, The wind caught hold of some of it and blew it near this pitiful horse next to me. I tried not to notice when the horse ate it quickly, and immediately searched the ground with her eyes for more, as if she hadn't eaten in weeks. In her eyes was a look of terrible sadness, and I could not help thinking that there was something about her that I recognized. While I thought this, I suddenly heard her shout,
"Is that you, Beauty?"
I was both excited and horrified to see that this horse was Ginger. But this was not the Ginger I so happily remembered. She was different now. Her once beautiful and strong body was now nearly destroyed. But not only had she lost her beauty, I could tell by the way she breathed very loudly that her health was very poor. I asked her to tell me what had happened since we had last seen each other. Her story was, of course, a sad one. After staying another year at Earlshall resting, she was then sold to a wealthy man who took very good care of her in the beginning. However, he decided to ride her very hard from morning to night one day, and this proved too much for her old back injury quickly returned, and she could no longer do the job. So he sold her to someone else, who then sold her to another person, and for some reason she continued to be sold again and again, each owner seeming much worse than the last. Then she was finally sold to a horse and carriage rental company.
"Because the man who is driving me today pays so much money to my owner, I'm often made to work 7 days a week."
But Ginger, I remember how strongly you used to fight people who treated you badly. Now it seems you've just given up, I could not help saying.
"That's true, Beauty. I found that fighting does me no good. If men choose to treat us badly, we are powerless to prevent it. But you look well cared for. I am so happy that at least one of us is living a good life. For me, it's all over. I hope that I die soon, but I hope that I die while working. I don't want to die in the gunyard like so many other horses."
I could think of nothing else to say. I felt a deep sadness for her. I didn't want her to die, but I didn't want her to continue to live such a horrible life either. I put my nose against hers to try and make her feel better. Her owner then came over and took her by the reins. Just before being led away, Ginger turned to me and said,
"You were the only friend I've ever had."
And that was the last time I ever saw her alive. I remember shortly thereafter seeing a cart pass by the cab station one morning, carrying a dead horse. I could not be sure, but the horse looked very much like my friend Ginger. Her eyes were empty, and from her mouth hung a large bloody tongue. I believe and hope it was her, for if it was, then I can at least be happy to know that she has finally found peace. Chapter 16. A busy city becomes even busier. One afternoon, as my master and I were returning home, Polly met us in the yard.
"I thought you should know that Mr. Bennet came by earlier to ask who it was you planned to vote for in the current election. I told him I didn't know. He said that he would come by later to talk with you directly."
He just wants me to put his posters all over my cab for people to see. I won't be here later, so you can tell him that I won't use my cab to advertise anyone. And I most certainly won't be picking up any of those drunken fools they pay to vote for them. He could see that Polly felt uncomfortable. Don't worry, Polly. There will be plenty of other people who need a cab on election day. And he was right, for we had many a passenger that day. There was the fat guy with the large briefcase who asked to be taken to Bishopsgate Station. There was a small group of folks who we took to Regent's Park, and of course there was the little old lady who wanted a ride to her bank. Almost every cab in the city was covered with different politicians' posters. The streets that day were absolutely crazy. All driving rules and proper behavior disappeared for the day. My master and I saw many a person get pushed to the ground by all the people hurrying about. This was the first time I had seen an election, and I had no desire to see another one after that. At about noon, we decided to take a rest and eat a bit. But as he took out from under his seat the food that Polly had given him for the day, a very poor young lady with a child in her arms walked by our cab. It was obvious that she had no idea where she was. After turning around several times, looking in all directions, she finally approached our cab and asked my master where St. Thomas's Hospital could be found. It seemed that she was not from London and had not known that today was election day.
"This little child is in such pain,"
she said, looking up at Jerry.
"He's now 4 years old and he still can't walk. I'm trying to get him to the hospital now for an appointment we'd made with a doctor there. They think he could possibly be helped, but I'm not quite sure how to find it. Could you tell me, sir?"
"Oh, it's much too far for you to get there on foot, and with all of these people around, you could very easily get injured. I'll just take you myself," Jerry offered.
"Thank you, sir, but I haven't got the money to pay you for it, so I'll just walk."
"I'm sorry, lady, but I can't let you do that. I know that if my family were in your situation, I'd want someone to help them. Now, just get in and forget about the money."
"Oh, you're such a kind man. Thank you so much,"
said the woman with tears coming down her face. But at that moment, 2 men wearing politicians' buttons on their coats and hats called for our cab. They seemed to be in a hurry. "If you'll excuse me, gentlemen, I've already agreed to take this woman in my cab. You'll have to find another," Jerry said. The men, however, didn't listen to him and got into the cab after pushing the woman away from the door. "I said I already have a passenger. Now kindly get out," he said more firmly. "We were here first. The lady can wait. Besides, we have somewhere important to be. Now get this cab moving, driver." "Fine, gentlemen. If you want my cab so badly, you can stay, but it won't be going anywhere as long as you're in it." And with that, Jerry jumped down from the driver's chair and started walking toward the woman. The men got out, calling Jerry all sorts of terrible names and telling him they would call the police, but they just called for another cab that was passing by instead. So, with the lady and her baby in the back, we soon headed for the hospital. And, thanks to our excellent knowledge of the city, we managed to avoid the busiest places and arrived at the hospital in no time. Once there, Jerry helped the lady and her child out of the cab and got the attention of the hospital workers and asked them to take her where she needed to go.
"I don't know what I would have done without you, sir,"
said the lady, still crying.
"I wish that I could somehow pay you for your help."
"Get that child walking, and that will be pay enough," replied my master, and waving goodbye, he said, "Good luck to you both." Now it was raining quite heavily, and as we were turning to go, a woman came running out of the hospital door and called for our cab. When she had got in and taken her wet coat off and become more comfortable, the lady took a good look at Jerry, and her face suddenly brightened.
"Are you Jeremiah Barker?"
"Yes, I am," he said. "Where would you like to go?"
"Paddington Station, please,"
she answered.
"And while we go, I'd like to hear about Polly and the children."
And through their conversation, I began to understand how she knew my master's family. It seemed that Polly was once this lady's house servant. Once Polly married Jerry, however, she stopped working for her, but both women still kept in touch afterward.
"What What's it like being a cab driver in the winter, Jerry? I remember Polly being quite concerned about your health last year.
Yes, I was coughing quite a lot then, but I seem to be doing okay now. Things do get a bit more difficult in the winter, but I always manage to survive.
I know you're good with horses, Barker, and I think you could do better than drive cabs all day. Why don't you contact me when you're ready to look for new work? I'm sure I could help you.
And taking out 5 shillings from her bag, she added,
And please be sure to give this to your wife. It's for her to spend on the children.
Soon came Christmas, the biggest holiday of the year, a time when people seem their happiest. That is, most people, except for the cab drivers. They don't get to take part in the eating, singing, and dancing that goes on during that time of year. No, they are the ones who are taking people to the parties and family gatherings to eat, sing, and dance. The hours were long and difficult, for the old people went out early and the young stayed out late. Often during the holidays, since so many people wanted cabs, it was common for passengers to hire the cab for many hours at a time. This way, they could go to a party and have the cab waiting for them when it was time to go home. This might have been great for the passenger, but it was terrible for the driver and his horse, for they had to wait in the freezing cold for an unknown period of time. Sadly, by this time, my friend Captain had already died. He had become too old to even walk any longer, so Jerry had no choice but to shoot him. Of course, everyone missed him terribly, but because we had many customers, there was no time to mourn. A new horse was soon bought, named Hotspur. He, like myself, had suffered an injury that he fully recovered from, but had damaged his coat so that the wealthy family he once worked for could no longer accept him. Because Jerry knew I was healthy enough, he had me working in the evenings. Unfortunately, I found that Jerry was not as healthy as I, for he had begun to cough quite a bit. And as we had to start working later and later, his cough worsened each day. The holiday season was nearing its end, but there was one last night to endure. New Year's night, the biggest party night of the whole year. Jerry and I knew that we would be out later than we had ever been. Early that evening, we drove 2 men to the west end of town. We dropped them off at a party at around 9 o'clock, and they asked that we return at 11 to take them back home. But they warned us that they might be a few minutes late in meeting us outside, since they would be playing cards. As always, we were right on time, but the men were not. An hour passed, and they still had not come. It had been raining most of the night, so we were both now very cold and wet. Jerry tried keeping himself warm by walking around the cab and jumping up and down. Every few minutes or so, he would check to see that my clothes were not falling off and making me even colder. But the more he exercised, the more he began to cough. He sounded worse than I'd ever heard him. Thinking maybe the men had decided to stay the entire night, at 12:30, Jerry rang the doorbell and was told to wait just a few minutes longer. The men would be coming soon. But it was not just a few minutes. It was 45 minutes later that they finally appeared at the door. The men didn't seem bothered about how cold we must have been. They simply ordered us to drive them home without a single apology for being so late. When we returned home, Polly was waiting for us. Jerry was so cold and coughing so hard that he barely managed to ask her to give me something warm to wear and to drink. I could tell he felt terrible, but he still dried me off very well and made sure that I got the food and drink I needed. It was not until late the next morning that I heard someone enter the stable. It was Harry. He did not seem his usual happy self. He was much quieter and did not whistle as he worked. When he brought us water later at noon, his sister Dolly helped him. My fears were confirmed when I heard her begin to cry and say that she hoped her father would soon get better. Harry tried to make her feel better, but he had obviously also been crying. And for the next 2 days, Harry and Dolly were our only caregivers, as Polly never once left her husband's side. Then a visitor came to the house. He was known as the governor. He had known Jerry for quite some time, for he too was a London cab driver, and the oldest one of them all, no less. "So, how's my friend Jerry doing, Ma'am?" he asked Polly.
"Not good, I'm afraid. The doctor says it's bronchitis, and he believes that today it will either begin to improve or worsen,"
she answered. "Well, then, I won't disturb him. I'll come back tomorrow to see how he's doing." And then he left. But, as he had promised, he came back just before sunrise and was greeted with the good news that Jerry's health had begun to improve. But my master would be in bed for 2 more weeks, slowly recovering. The governor proved to be a great friend during those days, for he came to the house every day and exercised Hotspur by having him pull his cab for a while. I did not get the same treatment because I was older and fully developed, so I hadn't as much need for exercise as the young Hotspur. And whatever money the governor made from his work, he gave half to Jerry's family to help pay for food and bills. And eventually, Jerry was healthy again. However, the doctor strongly suggested that he change his job, for pulling cabs was far too dangerous. Polly did not want Jerry to return to his job either, but she did not know how else the family could earn money. This made the future seem quite frightening for everyone. But then, one day, while Harry was working in the stable, his sister came running in, asking,
"Do we know anyone who lives at Fairstowe? I was just getting the mail with Mother when she started reading a letter from that place, and then ran upstairs to show Father."
Harry thought for a moment, and then he remembered. "You said Fairstowe, right? That's where Mrs. Fowler lives. She's the woman who gave us that money on election day. What do you think she wants, Dolly? Go and ask Mother." She hadn't been gone 2 minutes when suddenly she came running back into the stable yelling,
"You'll never believe it, Harry! Mrs. Fowler's offered our father a job. It seems that she's losing her coachman, so she's asked our father to take his place. And she's giving us a beautiful little house in Fairstowe, where all the rich people live. So it will be easy for you to find work too. You could be a stable boy or a servant or something, and I'll go to school."
"Not a servant boy," said Harry. "I don't like the clothing they make those people wear. I'll be a groom or a gardener." And so the new job and home were accepted. However, Jerry still needed a little more time to recover his full health and strength. Meanwhile, Hotspur, myself, and the cab were all to be sold, for our services would not be needed at Fairstowe. This was both wonderful and horrible news to me. I was happy for Jerry and his family, but I was sad for myself. The 3 years I spent working with Jerry were some of the happiest years of my life. And even though they had taken excellent care of me, I had grown older and lost some of my strength. I remembered my previous owners and how horrible a condition I was in when Jerry had first bought me. So I began to fear the kind of people to whom I might now be sold. Hotspur was sold to another cab driver, but I heard Jerry tell the governor that I was only to be sold to a good cabman who would properly care for me and not overwork me. I'm very sad to say that, after that cold and rainy New Year's Eve night, I never again saw Jerry, for the day I was led away from his home, he was still too ill to leave his bed. But the rest of the family came to see me go. Polly rubbed my head and said,
"I'm sorry that we can't take you to Fairstowe. We're going to miss you terribly. You have been the best horse we've ever had."
And with that, she then came near my face and kissed me good-bye, and Dolly did the same. Her face was wet with tears. Harry, however, couldn't say anything. He was simply too sad. He just patted my head and slowly walked away, kicking the dirt as he went, and then I was taken to yet another new home. Chapter 17. A Lady's Good Advice. My new owner was a corn seller. The governor told Jerry that he knew him and that he was sure I would be well taken care of. However, this was only partly true, for while I was certainly fed well, when it came to work, it seemed they expected more from me than I was capable of giving. Every time I was made to pull a load, it was always much too heavy for me. Jakes, my driver, could see that it was simply too much for me to handle, but his opinion was less important than the master's. For when he would suggest a smaller load to me, the master would reply, "We'll waste too much time and energy making 2 trips. Let's do it all in one." But that was not the only problem. The load was heavy enough, but what made it nearly impossible to pull was the bearing rein I was forced to wear each time. After about 3 months of working under such conditions, I had lost a lot of my strength. I had reached my limit when, one day, as I was pulling a much too heavy load up a hill, I stopped to rest for a moment. Jakes was apparently in a hurry, because he became very angry and started whipping me and threatening me, calling me lazy and no good. I tried my best to keep moving, but after a short distance I felt I needed another rest. When the whipping and yelling started all over again, I suddenly heard a woman's voice shout,
"Stop that! Please, stop whipping him! He's doing his best to pull the cart, but the load is too heavy and the hill too high."
"Well, his best simply isn't good enough, lady. It's not my fault that the load is so heavy. Anyway, I'm expected to deliver this corn quickly. I haven't time for this laziness," replied Jakes, raising his whip again.
"Look, just don't hit him again. That's not helping anything. If you'll listen to me for a moment, I may be able to help your horse."
Jakes laughed. "Okay, I'm listening. Let's see what a woman knows about horses."
"Well, the first problem is this bearing rein,"
the woman began.
"It's too tight. His head is pulled so far back that he cannot use all of his strength. I'm sure that if you took it off, he would be able to handle this load a lot better."
Jake smiled and said, "Whatever you say, pretty lady. Take the whole thing off."
"Well, if you can't take it off, just loosen it as much as possible."
Jakes did as she suggested, and I felt immediate relief once the rein was undone. I exercised my neck a little to try and get rid of the pain, and soon I was ready to try and pull the cart again.
"I bet that feels a lot better, doesn't it, boy?"
she said to me, touching me on the nose. Then, turning back to Jakes, she said,
"Now, put that whip away and just talk to him gently. Let's see how well he does."
"Okay, Blackie, let's get going," he urged. I lowered my head and began to pull the cart forward again. I was still very weak and tired from the earlier work, but not having that bearing rein to worry about made it possible for me to get the cart to the top of the hill before stopping for another rest. The entire way up the hill, the lady walked beside me, gently urging me on, and when I finally made it, she proudly turned to Jakes and said,
"You see what a little kindness will do for an animal? Now, I trust you will never put that bearing rein on him again. You've seen how much better he works without it."
Jakes admitted, What you say is true, but the fact is that everyone uses the bearing rein these days. If I don't use it, I'll look like a fool."
Actually, the fact is that I and many other people have not used the bearing rein for more than 10 years, and nobody seems to think of me as a fool. You and your employer are simply following a bad custom. Anyway, that's all that I have to say. I don't want to keep you from your work any longer. Thanks for trying my idea, though.
And after touching my head one more time, she left us. "Now that was a real lady," Jake said aloud to himself. "She spoke to me as she would a gentleman, and she really knows a lot about horses. I'll use her method whenever we come to a hill." And from then on, I never had any problems pulling an uphill load. But unfortunately, the loads did remain very heavy, and it soon became clear that I no longer had the strength of my younger years. I was then replaced with a younger horse and sold to a cabman. I have to say that I left the corn seller's place just in time to avoid losing my ability to see. He had kept his stable so poorly lit, it was almost like being blind, so little could I see inside. And then, whenever I was brought out into the sun, the change in light was always so great that it hurt my eyes terribly. All of his horses suffered from this, and many did, in time, lose their sight altogether. Chapter 18. Life Gets Even Tougher. And now my life was to sink to one of its lowest points. My new owner was a highly unforgettable man named Nick Skinner. He looked very unfriendly, with his black eyes and long, pointy nose, and when he spoke his voice sounded like a stick being dragged across a bed of rocks. Every cab he owned was in terrible condition, and every cabman he employed was a terrible driver. He worked us 7 days each week. Needless to say, the drivers were very unhappy, and they treated the horses as badly as the owner treated them. My driver liked to use a whip with a metal end. This was so painful, and my back was often covered in blood when I returned to the stable at the end of a day's work. Even so, I always worked as hard as I could, always thinking how true Ginger's words were when she said that all men are our masters. Things had become so terrible for me that, for the first time in my life, I had begun to wish that I were dead. And, to my surprise, my wish one day almost came true. It was almost the end of a typically long workday. I was feeling very tired and weak, as I always did at the end of the day, when we were requested to drive a man to the train station. Once there, and the passenger dropped off, we got in the long line of cabs waiting for the next group of arriving train passengers. Soon they came, and the long line quickly shortened, and we were approached by a family of 4 with a large number of travel bags. While my driver and the man of the family loaded the bags, the young girl came around to look at me. After a few moments, she yelled to her father,
"Daddy, this horse is too tired to carry the 4 of us and our bags all together."
"He'll be fine, young lady," my driver assured her. "He's quite strong." A train station worker who had begun to help with the bags suggested that the family take 2 cabs. "Look, can the horse pull the cab or not?" asked the father impatiently. "Of course he can, sir," my driver promised, as he threw the last of the bags onto the cab. This last bag was so heavy I could feel the whole cab lower a few inches. The little girl begged her father to do as the station worker had suggested, but he would not listen, and insisted that she get into the cab. The little girl had to do what her father told her, so she slowly climbed in next to her brother. The cab was so crowded with bags, the driver had almost nowhere to sit. He spent a few moments trying to clear a small area for himself before he finally whipped me to move forward. From the beginning, I had no idea how far I would get pulling this terribly overloaded vehicle. At every moment, I felt capable of falling to the ground from weakness. I somehow managed to pull the family to Ludgate Hill, but when we reached the top, I lost all control of my legs and fell heavily to the ground. I let out a terrible cry as soon as I hit, and for a few seconds I did not think I would ever breathe again.
"Oh, my God! What did I tell you people? I knew it was too much for him!"
shouted the little girl as she jumped out of the cab. I really believed I was dying, and I was hardly aware of what was happening all around me. I seemed to remember the reins being untied and cold water being poured over me. I was not sure how long I lay there on the ground, but I managed to get back on my feet. Then I was taken to the closest stables they could find and was given some food and allowed to rest. Later, at Skinner's stables, I was examined by a doctor. "This horse cannot continue to work as hard as you're making him," he said to Skinner. "I suggest you give him a half-year's rest in a field somewhere, and then he'll be ready to work again." "I don't have the time, money, or the fields to do such a thing. My horses work until they can work no more. Then I sell them for as much as I can get to anyone who'll take them." "Well, then, if that's how it will be, you could sell him at the horse sale next week. He's still pretty healthy. If you take excellent care of him from now until the sale, I'm sure you'll be able to sell him for more money than you would get from the meat market." When I was taken to the horse sale outside of the city, I did not fear it as much as I had in the past, because I knew that anything would be better than staying at Skinner's stables. Chapter 19. My Fate. It was a pitiful horse sale. I had never seen so many horses in terrible condition, and the people there to buy were not much better off than the horses themselves. I was glad that I was not sent to the factory to be killed, for I was still in pretty good condition, but there were some horses there that it would have been better to kill. But occasionally a handsome-looking horse would be led past my stall, and there were also some kind-looking buyers. One very nice old man seemed really interested in me, but I was not strong enough for the work he needed done. I had been at the sale for quite a while, when I then saw a man and a boy come walking out of the area where the best horses were being sold. The man had a very strong body, but a gentle face. He looked to be a wealthy farmer. As he walked along my row of horses, he stopped at my stall and looked at me with pity. I lifted my head and looked back at him. "Now, look here, Willie," he said to the boy. "This is an example of a great horse that has been treated very poorly." "What do you think they used him for, Grandpa? A carriage puller?" asked the boy. "You're right, boy. He sure is a handsome fellow, even with those marks on his knees. He must have had some very fine parents." The boy touched my nose. "Let's buy him and try to make him as healthy as he once was. You know, like we did with that other horse, Ladybird." "This one might be too old for that, boy." "I don't think so, Grandpa. He still looks to have many years ahead of him." "The boy seems to have a good eye for horses, sir," said the agent who was selling me. "It's true, he has worked too hard as a carriage horse, but he was just recently examined by a doctor. It was his opinion that this horse would be in excellent shape again after 6 months of proper care and rest. Now, I've only known this horse for 10 days, but I can tell you I've never seen a sweeter, kinder horse than him. I'll offer him to you for £5, sir, and I think that's a very fair price, for in 6 months he'll be worth 10 times that amount." "The horse we just sold brought in 5 more pounds than we had expected. Come on, Grandpa, we won't lose anything by getting him," said the boy to the old man. The farmer, after looking me over carefully, guessed my age to be around 13 or 14. Then he asked the agent to take me out of the stall for a better look. "Now, how much do you want for him?" he asked my agent. "Just 5 pounds, sir," he replied. "Okay, we'll take him." I was then taken to a hotel by a servant and given some food before being ridden to my new home. My new owner, Mr. Thorogood, told the stable workers that I was to be given fresh hay and oats twice each day, and that I was to be allowed to run in the field until evening. "Now, Willie, since you are the one who believed in this horse so much, I'm going to put you in charge of caring for him. Make sure he gets everything he needs," he said to his grandson. And he did just as his grandfather had told him. Every day, Willie would give me more attention than he gave the other horses. He cared about me a great deal, and he would often bring his grandfather in to get his opinion on how good a job he had done. After checking my legs, the man would say, "He's getting healthier by the day, boy. You're doing a wonderful job. In just a few more months, he'll be able to start working again, and then we can find him a new home." After 4 more months had passed, I was, one day, specially groomed. The workers cut my hair and made it look nice and shiny. I do not think I had ever looked so handsome in all my life. I knew that someone very important was going to be looking at me that day. They then harnessed me to a carriage and drove me 2 or 3 miles to Mr. Thorogood's beautiful home. Once we arrived, the old man left the carriage and went into his home, while Willie waited with me outside. Moments later, he reappeared with 3 women. One of the women looked old and weak. She was assisted by a much younger and happier-looking lady with dark eyes. The 3rd woman seemed very strong and healthy.
"You say he's fallen before,"
said the older lady.
"I would be very unhappy if he were to fall again."
"I understand, ma'am. However, most horses suffer these kinds of injuries in their lives and still go on to be wonderful workers," replied Mr. Thorogood. "How do you feel about him, Miss Bloomfield?"
"Well, Mr. Thorogood, I trust your judgment. We'll keep him for a week and see how he does with our driver. He'll come to get the horse tomorrow."
When the driver arrived the next day, he looked me over carefully. Seeing the marks on my legs, he became disappointed and said to Mr. Thorogood, "I'm surprised that you should recommend such a horse to the ladies, sir. Just try him for the week. If you're unsatisfied, we'll happily take him back," replied the old man. So I was taken to the ladies' stables. The following morning, when the groom came to brush me, he noticed the white hair on my forehead and said, "This mark reminds me of a horse I'd taken care of in the past." And then, when he saw the white hair on my foot, his eyes widened with joy. "Black Beauty, it's you!" he yelled as he put his arms around my neck. "Surely you remember me. I'm Little Joe Green, who nearly killed you by not giving you a blanket and warm water that night you saved Mrs. Gordon." I was so happy to see him again, and I tried to show this by putting my nose on his face. Later that same day, I was harnessed to a small carriage and driven to the front of the lady's house. Then the young, dark-eyed lady came out of the front door and down to me. Joe helped her into the driver's seat, and after several minutes of riding around, she said,
"Well, I feel pretty safe with him so far. I bet he's a good horse after all."
"You're right, Miss Ellen," Joe replied. "I know this horse very well, actually. He used to be Squire Gordon's."
"Well, then, I'll have to write a letter to the Gordons, telling them that their beloved horse is now under our care," the lady said. "They'll certainly be happy to hear that."
and for a week I was taken out and driven by each of the ladies. All of them seemed quite comfortable with me, even Mrs. Lavinia, who had worried so much about my falling again. So they decided to keep me. Now I've lived here for 1 year, and a happy one it has been. Thanks to Joe Green, I am receiving the excellent care I had received back at Birtwick Park, and I am now once again known as Black Beauty. Willie, my hero, comes to see me every once in a while. On one occasion, when Mr. Thorogood accompanied him, I heard the old man say that I should live to be at least 20 years old. After receiving the letter from Miss Ellen, the Gordons responded quickly, expressing their wish that I never be sold again, now that I am in such good hands, and the ladies promised to honor their wish. So here is where my story comes to an end, and with all my troubles and sadness behind me, I often find myself dreaming happily about that day at Birtwick Park, which I spent with my friends under the apple tree.